Great, and welcome back. In what ways have the attitudes and values of society or a time in history determined how people with disabilities are viewed and treated? Not until after the 1950s did the idea of normalization, or making available to the students with disabilities, individuals, and the pattern and conditions of everyday life, which are close to possible to the norms and patterns of mainstream society. So, the idea of normalization came into context. And the belief that environmental factors such as attention and interaction significantly affect intellectual outcomes, suggesting the importance of environmental factors in the development of intelligence. This research began the counterbalance of the philosophical effect of the eugenics in individual traits, notably intelligence, are inherited and are normally distributed in general population. The use of terms like retarded to refer to an entire group of people makes it easier to lose sight of their unique characteristics and to think of them in a devalued way. Because words can mean different things in different contexts, we need to be aware of the effect our words can have. If you look on page 9 of your textbook, you can learn more about this type of problem and the idea of having student first language or sensitive language. By sensitive language, we need to think about avoiding terms such as referring to a student as a victim of the disability, or suffering from the disability, or being afflicted with a disability. That these terms do present a stigma and an assumption on how the student accepts and handles having a difference. Now, the original special education law, PL 94-142, was originally titled Education for All Handicapped Children Act, but it was renamed to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in 1990, putting the person first and removing the assumptions of the handicap. You should read the Diversity and Focus 1.1 in your textbook. Classification can be used to create groups of individuals who are viewed as stigmatized or threatening, and it allows the culture to establish a barrier between those individuals and the normal members of society. The barrier between groups can be physical, like an institution wall, or it can be psychological, as when we subtly reduce our expectations of an individual. Pages 12 and 13 can help you understand. Here we have a comic, Shannon. Who calls you retarded? Jeremy, Bianca, Miriam, and that guy over there. They call everyone in special needs retarded. Well, I hate them for that. Shannon says, I don't. They just don't understand. They don't know us. Well, they're ignorant and they're mean. Well, it's not their fault. They were born that way. So we need to adjust our perspective on people with differences and think about how we might put them in groups to devalue them. Now, on that, we can talk briefly about what trends we see in the history of services for students with disabilities. The first trend was civil rights laws. It came out of the Brown versus Board of Education and the desegregation movement, and to the deinstitutionalization movement, where that we began with laws in 1973 to protect the civil rights of people with disabilities. So for all federally funded programs, there were set requirements to make reasonable accommodation. So this would include schools. And then, of course, in 1990, the Americans with Disability, or ADA Act, was set forth to cover the private sector so that all individuals could have the same opportunity in our communities and not presented with barriers in terms of employment, transportation, activities, accommodations, and telecommunications. However, these laws did not make provision for education. They were only equal rights and access to public and private facilities. But in 1975, we had the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which is now IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, with reauthorizations that have come about since. The foundational principles are the free and appropriate public education, and you'll hear that referred to as FAPE, that all students will have an IEP, an individualized education program, and that will be served to them, that program, in the least restrictive environment, or the LRE. This was rolled out in the 77-78 school year. They called that mainstreaming. So what trends did we see over time since then? Overall, distal programs in institutions and separate schools became more proximal arrangements where students were served in closer proximity to typically developing peers. They were no longer segregated, but rather integrated. So we changed the purpose of evaluation from making decisions about eligibility to making decisions about educational programs. And we don't have a them and us arrangement, but a one-box system where all students can be educated in the same school, in the same classroom. And we have a continuum of services for students under that least restrictive environment. The major requirements of IDEA are presented to you on pages 22 to 24 of your textbook. These are important to know, but essentially there are 6 principles. First of all, we have 0 reject, and that means all students with disabilities will be identified and served in our schools. Next, how do we determine those students? We must give a non-discriminatory evaluation, and that means that we don't use bias in our evaluation, cultural or poor validity, and indicating a student who doesn't speak English wouldn't be tested in English. Once a student's identified as needing special education, they would get an individualized education program, and that will be presented in the least restrictive environment, and that means as close to typical peers as possible, given supplementary aids and services in the gen ed classroom. Parents have a strong opportunity to participate in the process, and if there is a disagreement between either the school or the family, there is a due process where you can access a non-biased hearing officer. So with that said, I want to move into those assessment foundations. I'm going to stop the recording here and start a new recording for this segment. But I hope you're enjoying the information so far in this module.